Okay, well, it looks like we have quite a few folks joining us. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining today's virtual information session. We're here to talk about the updated draft floodplain maps that FEMA has recently released. And really, the goal of today's presentation is to help explain what changed in these new maps, where we really are in the overall update process, and then what these draft maps might mean for residents, property owners, and really communities across Harris County. We know that floodplain maps can raise a lot of questions, especially when people see changes near their homes. And so the goal is really to provide some clear information, reduce some confusion, and explain what happens next. So up front, there are three things that I just want to make sure are super, super clear. So the first is that these are draft maps. You'll hear us say the word draft many times during this session. These maps are not final, and they still have to go through a pretty extensive process that includes opportunities for public input from FEMA. Second, because these are draft maps, they have no regulatory impact today. They are not currently being used to change floodplain development requirements or other local regulations. And then third, again, since these are draft maps, there are no current impacts to flood insurance requirements today. So while these maps are super important and definitely worth reviewing from a risk perspective, they are part of a much longer FEMA process that we still have several steps to go through before these maps are final, effective, or start to impact anything on the ground. So on the next slide, we'll talk about what we'll cover today. So we'll talk through five sort of main topics. So first is the basics, what is a floodplain map and how is it used? The second is what's changed in the new maps, including updated rainfall information, new modeling, and then better topographic data. After that, we'll talk about where we are in the process, what happens next, and what residents should know at this stage. And then we'll end with a brief overview of an online tool where residents can look up information and compare current and draft floodplain information. So we can talk a little bit first about what a floodplain map actually is. So these maps are FEMA products that show flood risk based on probability metrics. At the federal level, FEMA is responsible for these maps across the country. And FEMA uses them alongside local floodplain administrators for regulatory purposes. So that is insurance requirements, and then local floodplain administrators use these to really determine building standards and other pieces of floodplain management. So these maps help identify areas that might be at a higher risk of flooding during certain storm events, and it's all based on probability. The last major countywide floodplain map update for Harris County was back in 2007. So this update, as you can imagine, represents a significant amount of new data, new modeling, and new information. And we've had a team working on this for quite a few years. So on the next slide, we'll talk about why these maps are being updated now. So since the last map update, we have experienced several major flood events, including but not limited to the Memorial Day flood in 2015, the Tax Day flood in 2016, and then, of course, Hurricane Harvey in 2017. And one of the most important lessons that we saw during Harvey was that flooding obviously did not happen just inside of a mapped floodplain. During Harvey, 68% of all structures in Harris County that flooded were outside of the regulatory 1% floodplain. So that tells us a few things. One is that the maps that existed were not fully reflecting the flood risk that many residents were experiencing on the ground. And it told us that updated draft maps were needed to provide a more current and more complete understanding of flood risk across Harris County. So let's talk about what's changed in these new maps. There are several major updates that we'll talk about on the next slide that are reflected in these draft maps. So more than 1,600 miles of channel were studied, and that includes about 400 miles of channel that had not been studied before. So that's analysis on channels that previously did not have analysis done on them. We also saw a need to update rainfall amounts. The new maps reflect about a 30% increase in rainfall amounts based on data that's coming from the federal government and other sources. The maps also use updated topographic data for Harris County, which gives us a better picture of how water might move across the landscape based on what is on the ground today. And then finally, the modeling really represents hundreds of flood risk reduction projects that had been constructed in the interim period and are now in the ground. So these maps are not just a routine update, right? This is a real level set to reflect better data, more detailed modern modeling, and a more current understanding of current conditions across the county. So there are a lot of different folks that are involved in the process to update these maps. On the next slide, you'll see some of the folks who are involved. FEMA is the leader of this process. They issue the official draft products and map products throughout the process as we move forward. The Flood Control District, locally from a Harris County perspective, supports FEMA's efforts by providing local perspective and technical information on behalf of the community. The 34 floodplain administrators across Harris County coordinate with the public and local elected officials. They help to gather some feedback, and eventually they're the ones who update local regulations. And then critically, residents have a really important role in this process. Residents can review the maps and provide feedback to FEMA and to their local floodplain administrators as this process moves forward. And it takes all four of these groups really working together collaboratively under the leadership of FEMA to make sure that this process is successful. Now, the next slide shows the full FEMA map update process. And you can see that it is a complicated one, and one that is institutionalized by the federal government and standard really across the nation. So the first step was technical data development. That's really where the Flood Control District came in and supported the preparation of really technical data to drive these maps. Then FEMA, this is where we are now, has released draft map products. And the initial audience for that is really the floodplain administrators across the county so that they can review and weigh in on the initial products. And again, that's where we are today. The next major public step will be FEMA's preliminary map release. That's when maps start to move into a more formal public-facing capacity. After that, FEMA hosts a formal appeal and comment period where members of the public and of the community and the floodplain administrators are able to provide comments and detailed information to perhaps update the maps a little bit more. And then FEMA reviews those comments, coordinates revisions as needed, and then eventually, the floodplain maps do become effective. And really the point of this slide is to tell you that we are not near the end of this process. We really are still near the beginning. The hard technical work has been completed, but there are still many steps to go before these actually become effective and begin to impact policy. So let's talk a little bit about what's in the maps. So the next slide shows kind of what FEMA floodplain maps do and do not represent. So these insurance rate maps typically depict certain types of flood hazards. And so those things include riverine and coastal flooding. You can see those on the top of the screen. Those are places where water is either coming out of channels around Harris County or where water is coming in from the coast to really influence flooding. However, FEMA maps do not represent local drainage issues or kind of shallow flooding. So that's the kind of the overland flooding and more community related flooding. And that distinction is really important because a property can still have flood risk even if it's not shown in a mapped FEMA floodplain. You'll hear us say this many times at the Flood Control District, but flood risk exists across Harris County. And these maps are a really important tool, but they are not the only understanding of flood risk and not the end all be all of who is at risk of flooding. If you live in Harris County, you should have flood insurance. And we do have a lot of information on our website about how you can do that. So for the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to Todd Ward, who is some of the brains behind this whole thing, to really talk about how these models come together and what technology drives this research. So Todd, take it away.
Sure. So I want to talk about the models that we use to come up with these flood risk estimates that we're presenting on our MapNext Navigator tool, and how we're using new data to make those estimates better than they were before. As Emily also already mentioned, we've got new rainfall estimates. So they're 30% higher than they were previously for the 1% or 100-year storm. but that information has been updated for all storm events that we've modeled, from the 10-year 10% event to the 500-year 0.2% annual chance event. Um, so that updated rainfall data is in our model. Um, we've used the new elevation data, the topography data that Emily mentioned, to generate new sub-watershed areas. So Harris County has 23 watersheds, and each of those watersheds is subdivided into sub-watersheds. Um, and the new ground elevation data that we've got helps us know, when the rain falls, where is it going? Um, and so that new higher resolution, more current LiDAR data is better than what was being used before. Then we also need to know, of that rainfall that hits the ground, how much of it is running off, or how much of that is not being absorbed into the ground. So that green and amped loss data and the impervious cover, that tells us, how much of the area of these subwatersheds does not absorb water, and of the areas that do absorb water, how quickly does it absorb water? Sandy soils may absorb faster than clay soils. And then, Clark unit hydrograph, that also is factored in. It considers how much on-site detention is in place. So when properties develop, they have more impervious cover. They would have more runoff if we didn't have detention criteria. So on-site detention mitigates those peak flow increases. And so that's considered in the TCNR calculation, as well as how efficiently are these sub areas at draining. So by efficiency, I mean, um, do they have a roadside ditch, or do they have a curb and gutter street? A curb and gutter street with storm sewers is going to drain faster than a roadside ditch. Um, and for the channels in those subwatersheds, have they been improved before? For most of the areas in Harris County, that answer is yes. And if they've been improved, are they concrete lined or are they grass lined? If it's concrete lined, it's going to be more efficient. It's going to convey flow faster. Um, so we put that sort of information into HMS, and that generates runoff hydrographs, and that's flow over time. Um, so that flow over time is something that we put into our HEC-RAS model. And our HEC-RAS model is a hydraulic model. It's kind of like a physics model that says, when you've put flow onto this surface, how does it behave? Where does the flooding occur when that flow is moving over that terrain? How high does the water get? How fast does it get? So we get that information, and it's a much more detailed hydraulic model than we've done before because of the 2D element. We're able to put in that detailed terrain data that we've mentioned before, to show, as a matter of physics, how is it flowing over that surface? And then we also have roughness information, because water flows more quickly over paved surfaces than grass, and more quickly over grass than a heavily wooded area. So all of that goes into these estimates of flood risk that we've presented on the MapNext Navigator. And I say all that to say that, no, every model is an estimate. No model is perfect, but I want you to take away that these are the best informed estimates that we've ever had for the flood risk in Harris County.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Todd. That's great. And I'm no one better than you to really kind of explain the technical aspects of these maps and really how they come together. And we will have in a minute kind of a demo of a tool that we have available for folks to be able to look at these maps in their areas. But again, kind of on the next slide, looking at where we are today. So we're entering a new phase of this process. On the next slide, you'll see a little bit of kind of where we are right now. So FEMA released draft maps to the 34 floodplain administrators and their associated elected officials for review. And I want to repeat, these maps are not final, they are not regulatory, and they are not yet even part of a formal public comment process. As I mentioned, we really kind of stepped in to avoided information and launched a viewer that displays the FEMA draft data in a way that is a little bit more accessible for the general public. Um, the flood control district's goal is really to help residents see the information, really understand what it means, and know what opportunities you'll have to participate before these maps are finalized. And I do just want to emphasize that residents will have multiple chances to make sure that their voices are heard before these maps become effective and regulatory. So this timeline on the next slide really shows what still has to happen. As mentioned, we're currently in that draft data release stage. And after this, FEMA is expected to release preliminary data to the public. You may have heard that the government was shut down for a few months. And so FEMA has really just come back from that government shutdown and are sort of assessing timelines for next steps. So we don't have a solid idea of when preliminary data release will happen. What you're seeing on this slide is really kind of based on the ideal standard practice. So as I mentioned earlier, FEMA then will host a formal appeal and comment period, make revisions, and then ultimately move through the final steps in the process. And based on the ideal FEMA process, there would be about 21 to 33 months, so between 2 and 4 years, before these maps become effective. That timeline can also extend if there are delays, and we do anticipate this taking a while. I mentioned that the last countywide map update happened in 2007. That process actually started back in 2004 and took 3 years to become effective. So this isn't necessarily out of the ordinary. And because of the advanced technical nature of the maps that Todd was talking about, we're actually seeing more intensive reviews and more intensive data analysis to accompany that. So on the next slide, I want to talk about a little bit of good news. There are, as I mentioned, hundreds of flood risk reduction projects that are incorporated into the models themselves. And there has been additional work completed since this analysis sort of cutoff period for data. So that includes work across Harris County. And I think one thing that we're really seeing in these maps is that flood risk reduction projects are making a difference. We know that no single project is going to eliminate all flood risk. And that risk really changes over time because of some of those things we were talking about before, rainfall rates, drainage patterns, et cetera. But we are excited to see the benefits of the projects that are currently in the maps. And then some of the ones that you see on the slide here have been completed since the maps were effective. And so we're excited to continue incorporating those benefits into the maps as we move forward. So before we do the online demo, I want to close with just kind of the 3 things that I think residents need to know. So first, we know that flood risk reduction projects are working. And Robert, if we could go to the next slide, sorry. We know that these projects are working. We can see it in the maps, and more work has happened, again, since the data cutoff, and we know more work is coming. This year is actually the year that the Flood Control District will bid more projects for construction than ever before. And so we're really excited to see that progress translating into reduced flood risk for our residents. The second, as I've said several times, is that these maps are draft, and there will still be years before regulatory changes occur. And the third is that Harris County residents will have multiple opportunities to provide input before maps are finalized. And so it's really important to review the information, to ask questions, and to stay engaged throughout the process. You saw residents as a real stakeholder group, right, as we move through this process, and feedback from the community is critical as we continue moving this forward. So on the next slide, I've mentioned our online tool, and I'm going to turn it over to Todd here in a second to kind of walk us through that. But during the demo, you'll see how you can use the interactive map to compare current and draft floodplain information. And I want you to remember that the information that we're showing is from FEMA, and it is draft. It's intended to help understand potential changes and to prepare for future public input opportunities. So really think about this as a decision-making tool for now, to really show risk and help people understand what risk they may be facing in certain areas. But we really see this as the basis for folks to be able to provide input moving forward. So I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Todd to talk a little bit more about the Navigator tool and what folks can see.
Thank you very much. All right. Now, if my screen is showing up, um, very good. Okay, so this is mapnext.org, and this has been the homepage for our MapNext effort to communicate with the public for a few years now. What is new is the Navigator interactive map, and you can access that through this page. So this is our homepage. If you scroll down a little bit, we have this Know Your Risk and Search Your Address bar, um, and I'll put in an address, and that will take us to our interactive map, our Navigator. First, there's a disclaimer that pops up, and we are aware of a technical issue on mobile sites that is temporarily preventing you from clearing this disclaimer. So right now you'll have to access it with a desktop, but keep checking back on mobile if you'd like to access this on the mobile. That'll be fixed soon. Also, a tutorial pops up that'll kind of walk you through what's on the site and how to use it. So it tells you how to search addresses from this navigator, how to use the comparison tool, how to use the navigation tools or the locations of the navigation tools, and then where to go for more information. So let's start with the navigation tools. So there's zoom in and out. There's a home page that'll take you to a whole county-wide view. This is more for mobile site. This is a find my location. So if you're out in the field and you've got your location services turned on, this will pan and the map over to wherever your location is. There's a full screen button that you can toggle on and off. There's base map selections. If you don't like this default background, we have kind of a lot to choose from. Some of the ones you might be more interested in are street view, and you can look at aerial view as well. But I'll go back to the default for now. And then just over here, there's kind of another way to search your address if you'd like. All right. And then from the full screen, I can close this out if I'd like to see a little bit more and I want to push this table of contents over to the side, or I can bring it back with this tab here. So by default, the zones that are shown are the MapNext draft flood zones. So there's our new floodway, our new draft floodway, the draft 100 year, the draft 500 year, which is a moderate risk, 100 years a high risk, and floodway is a very high risk that includes both depth and high velocity. And then everywhere else is a low risk according to, in terms of riverine and coastal risk. As we said, there's other sources of risk. Now, if you click the information button to the left of the layer, you'll get a detailed explanation for each of these zones. So the floodway, for example, says this zone is subject to high flooding depths and velocities. During intense rainfall events, the force of moving water in this zone can be a threat to vehicular and pedestrian safety. It's also potentially subject to flooding during smaller and lower intensity rainfall events that occur commonly in our region. And so you can get an explanation for each of those zones in depth by clicking this information button. We've also got a proposed flood type. This just tells you whether the type of risk that you're looking at is riverine or coastal. As we mentioned before, those are the two types of risk that are featured on the flood insurance rate maps. And so that's what we're presenting here on our tool today. So it's again, these are similar graphics to the ones we showed in our presentation. Coastal and riverine. And then finally, we have our mapping change location. So we can slide to compare what's effective today, which is, which is legal, which is the basis for whether or not you have to buy flood insurance and floodplain management regulations that the 34 NFIP communities in Harris County are using. And so you can slide this back and you can see a comparison of what it was, what's effective today and what the draft map shows. Um, as Emily mentioned, uh, you can see on Bray's Bayou, for instance, that the floodplain is smaller, even though we've got the additional rainfall, the 30% higher rainfall. But because of the benefits of Project Braze, the floodplain is smaller than it was before. Um, and so I'll look up another address just so you can see how this works when you're looking up an address um, from this tool. Right, this is one of our buyouts. So this is a very high risk area. Um, and so you can see again that it used to be in the floodway and it's still deep in the 100-year floodplain, but it's no longer in the floodway. And that's in part to do that we're recalculating floodways in a different way under MapNext. Um, right,
And Todd, one other thing that I think is really interesting about the sort of effective maps and the current maps is just the level of detail that you can see. So if you kind of push the map up a little bit, yeah, you can actually see where streets are shown versus just kind of general polygons and general blobs that were there before. And so I think that really speaks to what you were talking about earlier with the types of data and the detail of the data that's included. So can you talk about that a little bit?
sure. Um, yeah, just as you said, you can see how these layers they have more definition in that they are more detailed. They kind of go around the nooks and crannies of the terrain because we have that additional information now. We're not only to map against, but it's our analysis has that additional information, so we can present that data. And so it's just better information for really all the decision makers in Harris County, from the public to us as an organization as we prioritize our projects. The better we know where the problems are, the better we know how to start fixing them. Um,
No, I
um,
think that's great.
okay.
No, go ahead.
Uh, and you can also see, some areas have additional overflows. It's just, um, like I said, in some places we have our benefits from our projects, but in some places we're showing additional risk because those previous rainfall estimates were an underestimate, and our modeling is doing a better job of capturing risk that we weren't capturing before. And we have, as part of our modeling effort, we are calibrating this data to historical information. We're running these models with previous events, the rainfall from previous events, and seeing if we can replicate the flooding from different events. That's both on our gauges. So we have gauges across Harris County where we have the elevation of historical events. How high did the water get along the channel? And then we also know where there's been reports of structural flooding. Um, and so if we were doing our analysis and we found that there were, clusters of structures that got flooded and we're not capturing that anywhere, we went back and we revised our models so that we would capture the the types of flooding that people are seeing in their community. We we don't want people to be caught off guard.
So, Todd, I'm seeing a couple of comments. I see one from Laurel, one from Tom, and one from Samrat that are kind of asking generally about the timeline for this. So like the data cutoff for, the projects and the efforts that are included in these updated models, and then also the process for kind of continuing to keep them updated moving forward with new projects. So
Mhm.
can you talk a little bit about that? So, that initial period where we kind of had to determine a cap for what went
Yeah.
into this, right? And then
Mhm.
what the process is moving forward.
Sure. So, so at the base level, the LiDAR that we used, the ground elevation that we used was 2018 data. And so, uh, by default, anything that was in that geometry of that ground elevation was included in our analysis. And in addition to that, for a few years, we were soliciting information from the engineering and development community so that they could provide us um, terrain data for smaller areas where development has happened since 2018. And we did that up through 2020. So January of 2020, we had a cutoff. If people provided us that terrain data, we could incorporate that into their modeling, to our modeling, and and we could put that into our results. In addition to that, LOMARs letters of map revision, there's a FEMA process that when a project is complete and you need to update the effective information with the change in flood risk resulting from that project, you can do a letter of map revision, and that can update the effective data. And you can actually see there's outlines of some of the old LOMARs that have been effective through Harris County. So if that was already effective, FEMA wanted us to capture that in our modeling, even if that was past that 2020 deadline, or at least capture it in our mapping. Um, and so that's what is that's kind of a timeline of when or what data is being incorporated into MapNext. And I would say the draft are based on LOMARs that were effective probably up until the draft data was published in February of 2026.
Awesome. And then moving forward, talk about that process.
So yeah, moving forward, of course, the draft data is published. What comes next is the preliminary. So FEMA's going to work on um, preparing preliminary data for public release. At that time, we'll have some additional data to share. The models will become public, um, or at least by that time. We'll be sharing information that's it's not just so this data is all better estimates than before, but the estimates aren't just better, they're also more in depth. And we have information about annual chance of flooding, the depth of flooding, water surface elevations, and then we'll have some products that FEMA asks us to make of community flooding. So that's not on the firms, but we have done that analysis, um, and we'll be sharing that once the preliminary data is out. Right now the purpose of this tool is to kind of show what's in the draft data that's been published, but that additional data will become public. All those what FEMA calls flood risk products that don't have regulatory effect, but they help people better understand their risk with more information about that risk.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I just felt like that was worth spending a moment on.
Mhm.
Um, so I'm seeing a couple of questions, one from Randy, one from Jim Robertson. Hi, Jim. For some additional information about floodplain administrators, who they are, how they can send comments, things like that. And I think I saw one further up. We actually have all 34 floodplain administrators listed on our website. So if you go to contact us on the Harris County Flood Control District page, then there is a little tab. Oh, thank you. For you to be able to view those. And I think that, when I look at perfect right there, floodplain administrators, top middle. Yeah. So depending on where you live and what municipality or area you're in, you'll be able to see your floodplain administrator. So each city inside of Harris County has a floodplain administrator, including the city of Houston. And then unincorporated Harris County also has a floodplain administrator, and that is someone who sits in the office of the county engineer for Harris County. And so all of their contact information is available on our website. We keep that updated. And if you need any additional information, feel free to reach out to us as well. One of the things that Jim was asking is, sort of who are these folks and how are they chosen? So all of these folks are government employees. They work for the, specific municipality or the county. And, I am actually not sure how they're chosen. Todd, do you know the answer to that question?
Um, no, I mean, I suppose they're uh, appointed by the elected officials, I would guess,
Yeah,
or hired by their delegates. You know,
right. Yeah, and Jim, to your question of whether or not they're credentialed, they go through training that's specific to that role. And so, and of course, there are teams that really work on this, but there's one person who's kind of the point person. So, um, one question that I know Karin Cambio, hello Karin, had is Todd, can you show how to input the addresses again? I think that the map next header, the navigator header, is over the box for people. Perfect. Yeah.
yeah. If you're having trouble with that, you can go full screen, and that'll make it easier to access this. But we will fix that. So again, if I wanted to go to 9900 Northwest Freeway,
Yeah, great.
there we go.
Perfect. Yeah, so it's just in that kind of top, what is that? Right, left-hand corner.
Yeah,
Yes, left-hand corner. And
yeah.
then
Top
you
right and
can
top left. There's another one here.
yes, and you can type in your address and search that way. Um, so a couple of other questions that I'm seeing from folks like Jack and a few others is about subsidence. So Todd, can you talk about how about subsidence kind of generally and how that might be reflected in these maps as of obviously the cutoff date? And then sort of moving forward, I'm assuming that the next time that we would sort of see a big reflection in that would be the next time that we update the topography, but just want to get your thoughts.
Well, I'm not exactly a subsidence expert, but our new our LiDAR that was flown in 2018 is on a new vertical datum, and I believe that accounts for subsidence somehow. I don't know if I don't know how to answer that better. Sorry, I'm not really a subsidence expert.
We got it from a couple of folks, so let us look into that for you, and make sure we've got the right folks plugged into that conversation. I'm sure if you're asking the question, then you know that subsidence is a very complicated topic, and one that I want to make sure that we track down for you. So I am seeing some questions about like individual projects, individual neighborhoods. I'm going to stay away from those sort of in this public area, just because I'm trying to make sure all the questions are really relevant to everybody. We are getting some questions about sort of policy that flows from these maps, and I think we had one pun that I saw of using flow as kind of the pun there. But so ultimately, policy decisions around building codes and building regulations are set by those floodplain administrators. In the past, Harris County and the city of Houston have kind of worked together to set the standard for the region. But that doesn't mean that, necessarily every single, building code will look exactly the same. So those groups each, kind of take all the data in, and their elected officials ultimately set policy. So that is really done on sort of an individual basis. Typically, the timeline that happens is when this data is adopted as what's called best available data. And that is a community by community decision. So, Harris County, City of Houston, each entity has to adopt this data. Our 2 cents has always been that, it is prudent in some instances to make sure that the community has an opportunity to comment. But that's, it can kind of happen at different places. What we know is that the analysis that really informs this data is some of the most advanced in the nation. And so we're very confident in these models and in this data. We do also know that the more quickly that these models become effective, the more quickly we have the opportunity to incorporate new projects and new things that are on the ground. So, that is a process that we still need to move through, as we were talking about, but the policies themselves are really set at the local level. Oh, it was Stephen who had the pun. Thank you, Stephen, for letting me borrow that. I'm also seeing some questions about how this might impact things like the Harris County underground drainage tunnels and things like that. These maps really are a regulatory tool from FEMA. And I want to be clear about that. So to Todd's point, we are able, as folks who are planning flood risk reduction projects across the county, we're able to really look at these and say, here's where we're seeing some increased risk or some unique types of risk that could perhaps be addressed with different tools in our toolbox. But we have been operating with this increased rainfall data to plan our projects for quite a while. And so we are incorporating that into our project plans. And, if anything, this kind of just puts a finer point on some of the pieces that we've been able to see moving forward. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of very specific questions. So here's two that I think perhaps we could sort of take together. So, and Todd, I'm going to flip these to you. So I saw a note from Scott and then also from, I think it was Allie. Yeah, about, potentially a home is now in the 100-year floodplain, but they've never flooded. That property has never flooded in the past. Can you talk about why that might be the case? And then Allie was noting that some streets are within the floodplain while the adjacent homes are not. So can you kind of talk about the sort of the risk product part of it, and then also sort of why folks might be seeing that difference between streets and parcels?
So, well, I talked a little bit about how we've updated these estimates. I've heard specifically some people say before, well, we didn't flood during Harvey, and so why would we be in the 100-year floodplain? And in that instance, Harvey wasn't the worst flood that every channel in Harris County has ever seen. And in some parts of the county, it was tax day. In some parts of the county, it was Allison. Or so, depending on the age of the home, maybe it hasn't flooded, but maybe it's in an area that might be flood prone. Additionally, it's a 1% annual chance event. So any given year, it might have a risk, but it might have been lucky for a while now. And I would say, sometimes the streets might flood when the structure doesn't, and that's on purpose. That's how they're designed. That's how the streets are designed in some places, so that when water, when it rains, the water floods the streets, but not the homes, because the streets won't be harmed. They'll be, we want people to have access, but it's designed so that the roadways will carry water until the local drainage can drain them out, and so houses are usually built higher than the streets, so the streets might flood when the houses don't.
Yeah. And then I saw a note kind of related to that, Todd. I saw a note from Kimberly saying that, her address might not show as high or low risk, but she knows her street floods. So what do you think that would be a factor of some of that community style flooding that we were talking about earlier?
Yes, it very well could be.
Yeah.
I've already gotten some feedback through our email account that have pointed out an area that residents understand it's flooded during several of our recent events, and it's not shown in the mapping that we're showing today. And that when I investigated that further, that's because the source of that flood risk isn't riverine. It's local flooding. Um, and and we'll be sharing some of our local flooding analysis with the public in the months to come.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm seeing a lot of questions about like how folks can kind of connect with our team to talk about specific locations. I saw that from Jeff and from a few others. Um, what we're planning to do after this session is any of the comments that are really specific to a certain area, our team is going to follow up with folks on to make sure that we're having those conversations, in as much detail as they need. And so just be on the lookout for that. The other thing that we're doing is we mentioned we're not in a formal comment period with FEMA yet, right? So FEMA is not necessarily soliciting feedback on these maps yet. But one of the things that we as the local partner are doing is really kind of trying to step in and make sure that we're providing and collating any feedback that we receive in the interim. So I want to rest assured that anything that you're sharing with us today will, in fact, end up making it into FEMA's hands as we move through this process. Um, can you talk a little bit? I don't actually don't know what the answer to this question will be, but we're getting some questions about the reservoir releases and sort of how they might or might not be represented in these maps. I'm assuming they're not, but can you talk about that a little bit, Todd?
Um, as I recall, at the 100-year flood level, a 1% annual chance flood level, um, the the reservoirs, as we understand them to be operated, would not have releases. Um, at the 500-year or 0.2% annual chance event, they do reach a level where the reservoir would be operated with releases, and I think that we incorporated that into our modeling of the 500 year on Buffalo Bayou. But that is something that I can double check to make sure.
Awesome. Perfect. Oh, and yeah, we got some additional questions about that as you were talking. So perfect. I saw a note from Robert asking if there's a website where formal feedback can be provided to the flood control districts. The answer to that is yes. So the site that you see Todd on right now, our mapnext.org site, is one place for that. And then you can also submit comments through the flood control district's main website. So there are multiple avenues for that. And I can say that all of that goes directly to my team. And so happy to field those. You can also see on the screen here where Todd is, an email address that you're also able to reach out to. We wanted to make sure that there were multiple opportunities for folks to be able to submit that. Um, okay, sorry, I'm seeing a lot of scrolling through all the very specific questions. Apologies. Um, Todd, can you revisit, because we are still getting some questions about, even if we aren't talking neighborhood specifics, can you talk again about like these maps are based on the 2020 data? What about the projects that have happened since then? When will those be incorporated? Can you kind of talk about that?
Well, I would say moving forward, um, once the preliminary information is out, LOMARs that are submitted to FEMA, as I mentioned before, LOMARs are how we update the effective information to reflect the change in flood risk as a result of projects and developments and that sort of thing. Would need to be done on both what's effective today and the map next data, because they want you to prepare data so that when map next is effective, they have that ready to go, and they can do that. They can issue a LOMAR that will update the map next data with that flood risk change resulting from that project. Um, so when we complete projects, we've been talking about how we would work on LOMARs to model and map the benefits of those projects. So that is something that the flood control district would be working on with FEMA, so that we can, as we complete these projects, get that flood risk data updated to show those project benefits.
Perfect. And Robert, that kind of gets to your question as well about, whether these are taking into account those changes and improvements that are happening now. Um, I've seen a lot of questions of, my home has never flooded, or, my cul-de-sac has never flooded. How are we now, included in certain, whether it's the 500 or the 100? And, one of the things that I think anybody who's worked in this field can say is that I don't know that we've ever seen a real life event follow a model. I just don't think that that is the way that rain works. However, this is really kind of our and FEMA's best assessment of risk, right? Based on sort of the parameters that FEMA has in place. So Todd, can you expand on that a little bit more from a technical perspective? I can always talk about it from what we see at OEM during a flood event, but when you're looking at models, what do these 100 and 500 really represent?
Yeah, so the 100-year and the 500-year events, those are what we call design storms. And they're kind of a specific 24-hour event. Based on the statistical analysis, we say we get so many inches of rain over a 24-hour period, and that has a 1% annual chance of happening in any given year, or a 0.2% chance of happening in any given year. So that's a storm, but it's not, even in other storms where you get rainfall, which is meets those totals, the rainfall may come in a different way. If and I can show an interesting example if I go to our flood warning site. So, oh, pull side. So let's take a look at Harvey, for example. If I go back to Harvey, which is now a while ago now, I have to click a lot to get there.
As I say, this is also a great little tool for folks to know that exists. This is basically historic rainfall across Harris County. You can either look at the last day, or as Todd is doing, you can look at Harvey.
All right, so look at White Oak Bayou, for instance. Now, if you look at the gauge, the rain gauge here, and you look at this rainfall total, this 22 inches of rain that fell over 2 days. But what we find is that the rainfall pattern is such that, the stream level came up, but then you got a little break in the rain and the stream level went back down. The stream level came up, you got a little break and it came back down. And so these actual storms don't behave all the time like or any of the time exactly like our design storms. Sometimes the rainfall patterns are such that the like on a tax day event, the 24-hour totals may not be that impressive, but the 6-hour totals are so impressive. They're so intense that it floods areas worse than more rain over a longer period of time might. And so it can have a lot to do with just how, what is the rate of rain that we're getting, like very specifically sometimes.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. I don't know that I've actually seen that specific one, but
That's the
it's very
closest case to
illustrative.
my house. So
Got it. Okay, I think we've got time for maybe just a few more questions. I did see a note from Doris asking if folks have access to these interactive maps now, and the answer to that is yes. So those are available on our website as well as on the Map Next website. You are able to type in your address and view this information in real time. This is, or not in real time, sorry. Currently, you're able to kind of see this data. One of the things that was really important to us is that the way that FEMA releases this data is just, frankly, it's really not accessible to the public in a helpful way. And so we sort of took the FEMA product and translated that same data into something that's much more intuitive for the general public to use. I can tell you that I've spent a lot of time talking about these maps, and when I looked at the FEMA product, I was quite confused. So even folks who live and breathe this every day needed a little bit of a translation there. Um, I did also see a question from Robert asking, if we can sort of advise an estimate on when the maps would be considered approved and not draft. Robert, I would love to be able to guess that for you. I think at this point we're really trying to work with FEMA to move this process forward, especially with them coming back from the shutdown. I think our best estimate at this point is minimum 2 to 3 years is what we're looking at for this process to move forward. But we're very committed as a local partner to continuing to provide updates to the community as that process moves forward. Our goal is to make it move as quickly as we can. But, we also recognize that there are a lot of hurdles that we still need to jump through. So two final questions, and then Todd, I think we're going to have to wrap, but one is from Stephen and Steve, and then the other is from Bob. So Stephen and Steve are really asking about elevation as it relates to these maps and elevation certificates and that kind of thing. I know that that's something that comes with the next release, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. As part of the next update, well, or the next big update to the tool when the preliminary maps are out, when you search your address, you won't just have the map. You'll have kind of a little report about your property specifically. And that will include an estimate of your finished floor elevation, or like so if you're not familiar with that term, it's say your first floor if you have a two-story house. And so that estimate is based on one of a couple of things. So there's a data set called Cyclomedia that we have, which is kind of like a Google Street View, but with elevation data in addition to imagery. And so from that, we can extract kind of an elevation from people's, the images of people's doorsteps. And so that's been done by a third party. And we've taken that and we've given that in our report as an estimate of the finished floor elevation for your home. So you can compare that elevation versus the elevation of the water in these design storms. So to kind of give you an idea of, are you at risk of flooding if that design storm were to happen? If so, how deep? Or if not, how far above it are you? And so that can kind of help you prepare for flooding. You have a better idea of how severe you might expect to flood, or how safe
You
you are.
might see, yeah, you might see that inundation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna give the very last question is from Bob. And he's asking about whether these design storms are calibrated to real life events. Can you just very succinctly answer that?
So I would say that the design storms come from the NOAA Atlas 14 rainfall estimates. So those are the 24-hour 24-hour events that have certain annual chances of giving us certain rainfall totals. But those designs, so that rainfall that's a design storm is run on a model that's been calibrated to real life events. So we kind of build the model with the geometry and all of the data that we have, and we run it on real events, and we see are we, with the rainfall from those real events, are we replicating the flooding from those real events? And we've done that with 3 events each for all of our watersheds. So it's not overtrained to one storm. So we get a kind of we see that this model behaves well for different types of storms, and then we run that design storm to get those 100 and 500 year and all those other different design storm elevations. I would also say that we do not just statistical analysis on the rain, but statistical analysis on our gauge elevations. So, we try to get our gauge elevations and prove that the elevations that we're seeing in our design storm 100 year seem to be within a confidence limit of or confidence interval that the elevation, we're seeing that elevation in the channel, maybe, a 1% annual chance um, amount of time, you know. So
That's great.
the answer is yes, in a number of different ways. We are doing that.
Can attest. No, that's awesome, Todd. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to close with a thought from Cypress Creek's very own Jim Robertson, who put something I think very sort of nice to close with in the chat. And he says, a thought is that most homeowners would never consider not carrying insurance to cover a fire in their home. But living in Harris County, he says we have a greater chance of our home flooding than catching fire. And I think that, certainly that is something that the Flood Control District really believes. I will do one final plug that if you live in Harris County, you are at risk of flooding, and we do recommend that everybody have flood insurance. I think that the tool that Todd walked through today, do you mind flipping back over to that, Todd? Is a great way for folks to really assess risk and make some decisions. But again, ultimately, this is part of a long process that we are still working through with FEMA. I don't want folks to feel like there are immediate regulatory or insurance changes. And really what we are focused on right now is providing a more updated view of flood risk in Harris County and really giving residents, governments, and FEMA an opportunity to review and discuss the information before maps become final. I saw a couple of requests for follow-up information coming out of this session. We do have this recorded, and so we will be posting this to our website. And then we'll also make sure alongside that to post things like the floodplain administrator contact information and others. And so I'll just make sure that those are in and that folks have access to it. But I really appreciate everyone for taking the time to join today. This is the first in a series of these meetings that we'll be doing. So share with your neighbors and your friends, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.